So our second student speaker is Ellen Jehozowak. Ellen is a nursing education specialist currently supporting surgical inpatient, outpatient clinical areas, and is a facilitator for the Mayo Clinic Nurse Residency Program. Prior to this role, Ms. Jehozowak was an assistant professor at a Midwestern academic institution teaching adult medical and surgical nursing, trends and issues in nursing, and was a clinical instructor. Ellen has worked as a staff nurse for 21 years in various settings, including the intensive care unit, telemetry, and surgical nursing. Ms. Jehozowak is board certified in nursing, professional development, and has a passion for curriculum development, novice nurse transition, evaluation methodology, and evidence-based practice. So please welcome Ellen.
Well, thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here this morning and share my DNP journey. So the title of my project is Transforming Nursing Orientation Using a Tiered Skills Acquisition Model. The objectives today are to discuss the background of clinical nursing orientation, describe the aim of this project, explore Dr. Benner's novice to expert model, describe my model of novice nurse transformation, explore the methods, the tiered skill acquisition model, and what is this, look at project outcomes, and then of course discuss lessons learned. So a little bit of the background. As Joyce alluded to, I'm a nursing education specialist. I work with new nurses in orientation. I also work with staff, preceptors in staff development. As I describe in the presentation today, the term orientee refers to a new nurse in orientation in a new clinical area. The term preceptor means a nurse that's mentoring, guiding them, and evaluating them in orientation. And the term orientation really is the training that takes place while a new nurse is on a clinical unit. So some of the background, there is a large gap between what nurses learn in nursing school and what is expected of a nurse when they appear in clinical practice. There is a gap that we need to identify strategies to help assist with this. Nurses new to a clinical area oftentimes struggle with time management, prioritizing, delegating, and critical thinking. Historically, at the organization that I work at, we used a one patient incremental productivity model for orientation. So the preceptor and the orientee would work together with one patient, doing all cares and interventions for that one patient. Once things got stable and the orientee was comfortable with that one patient, they would increase to 2 patients, work on all the cares for those 2 patients, and 3 and 4 and so on. So that's kind of the incremental productivity. We know from nurses new to a clinical practice area that they were struggling with time management, delegation, and prioritizing. So it was really hard to teach these solid foundational skills that they need to be successful in practice with only having one patient at a time. It's hard to delegate and time manage with one. So we knew that there was an opportunity to look at things a little bit differently with orientation. Surveys from orientees at the end of their orientation also indicated that they could use more practice, more time with a full patient assignment to gather those foundational skills. We were also noticing that there were extra shifts needed at the end of orientation for some nurses that were in orientation, needing to add an extra 3 shifts, 4 shifts, or an extra week or 2. And we wondered, why is that? Why are we adding extra shifts? So preceptors and I looked at the survey data from orientees. We also looked at some of the literature that's out, that's published on orientation and precepting. And we came up with an idea of a different design for orientation. So the gap that was identified was the process for preparing new nurses during orientation. The aim of this 2-year quality improvement project was to improve the quality and efficiency of the RN orientation through what I just termed a tiered skills acquisition model. I will further reference that as TSAM, and that's what it's become known as in the organization in which I work. I should mention the photo here is actually of a preceptor on the left, David, and an orientee, Tara, during the orientation process. Here they're working on some clinical debriefing, some critical scenarios, some medication event scenarios, and this is all part of the process of the tiered skill acquisition model. So theoretical concepts help us inform our nursing practice. We know we need to look at theories to better develop processes and systems to make changes in clinical practice. So it was through the lens of Dr. Patricia Benner that I began to explore novice to expert nursing. Dr. Benner really studied nurses' reactions and responses to clinical situations. She looked at stages of clinical competence from novice to expert. Dr. Benner stated the novice is a new nurse new to a clinical situation. This could be a nurse in nursing school just emerging in practice. Dr. Benner also defined advanced beginner as a nurse that's new to a clinical area that needs support, needs evaluation, needs feedback and structure in order to be competent. Dr. Benner stated a competent nurse is typically one that's been in the clinical practice area for about 2 to 3 years. They have strong clinical skills. They actually, Dr. Benner did some more research, and it actually says that the competent nurse makes an excellent nurse preceptor. They are early enough, they know what it's like to still be new, but they have good, strong foundational skills in practice. The proficient nurse, as defined by Dr. Benner, is the nurse that perceives situations as whole rather than just segmented parts. The expert nurse has many, many years in practice. They have a systematic approach to their practice. They're intuitive. They use wisdom. They look for different ways of delivering care based on evidence. We know that the nursing environment is a very complex environment, so it takes continuous development from novice to expert to have a successful team. Through the experience of working with orientees and working with TSAM and revising TSAM, I developed this model I've titled the Novice Nurse Transformation Model. The tree is actually a practice metaphor for nursing. I used a tree as a metaphor 3 years ago in one of the first courses here at Augsburg. The tree transforms during the year. Spring buds, like we see outside today. It turns to summer full green foliage. Fall, we have typically a beauty of yellow, green, gold, red, depending on the tree. And winter, we have a bareness of the buds have left, branches are visible, and the tree has a beauty all its own. The new nurse transforms during that first year of practice through guided orientation and support. The trunk in this model represents the orientation process. You'll notice that having a strong, solid foundation in orientation produces learning, support, competence, and retention. The large branches represent the novice nurse, the patient, and the nurse preceptor, who are all integral to the orientation process. The novice nurse, patient, and preceptor are very much interrelated. The results of a successful orientation are the large leaves in the canopy: patient-centeredness, safe practice, and quality outcomes. You can see around the outer aspect of the tree are Benner's novice to expert. In the tiered skill acquisition model, I'm focusing pretty much on the novice and the advanced beginner related to Dr. Benner's work. So transformation does actually occur in all these elements. The orientee is transformed through the process of orientation. The preceptor is transformed doing teaching and learning. And the patient and family are transformed from the care that they receive from the care team. So what is the tiered skill acquisition model? I have a short 4-minute video that explains the model. I usually share this video with new orientees on their first or second day of orientation so that they have a better understanding of what their role responsibilities are. I've also used this video for teaching preceptors what their role responsibilities are. So we'll just listen to this short video.
Precepting in a tiered skills acquisition model is a way of orienting that allows the orientation to adjust to the orientee's needs. Let me explain how it works. The preceptor and orientee work closely together, having a full patient assignment. Yes, right from day one, a full patient assignment. The orientee will follow the preceptor's schedule from the very beginning, and orientation will be broken up into tiers. The orientee will become responsible for a new set of skills during the progression of each tier. Rather than focusing on everything a nurse must do for one patient, it allows the orientee to focus on a certain skill. The full patient assignment enables the orientee to practice that skill numerous times. Once the skill is mastered, the orientee may move on to the next tier. Now remember, the preceptor and the orientee are one. Whenever either of them is doing something for the patient assignment, both parties should be present. The orientee will start with a low set of skills in the tiers. For example, the tier may consist of completing vital signs, assessments, and documentation of the assessment. This is the only part of the patient assignment the orientee is responsible for. The orientee will observe the preceptor managing the rest of the assignment. As the orientee does these tasks on the full patient assignment, the repetition allows them to be successful sooner than if they only did it one time on one patient. Once the orientee has mastered the skills in the first tier, they can be moved on by the preceptor to the second set of skills. Now the orientee will be responsible for all the skills in the first tier and the second tier, and the orientee will observe the preceptor managing the rest of the assignment. The process of adding skills by moving through the tiers continues throughout the orientation. The tiers have an average amount of shifts anticipated for the orientee to complete, but the best part is that the preceptor can move the orientee faster or slower through the tiers, depending on their assessment of the orientee's knowledge and performance. You would never move an orientee through a tier based on date only. The real measure of tier completion is orientee performance. If an orientee is moving more slowly through the tiers than expected, please notify the unit NES. Let's talk about some of the key advantages of a tiered skills acquisition model. First, the orientee gets exposure to many more patient experiences, procedures, tests, and different diagnoses because they get to see a full patient load every shift. Second, it allows the orientee to see the preceptor time manage and prioritize how to work with a full patient assignment. And third, it allows for individualization of the orientation, as the orientee can move on to the next tier as soon as mastery at the current level exists. A secondary advantage is that unit staffing is helped out, especially when you have multiple orientees, because they can each take a full assignment. Finally, we must talk about zero patient time, also called resource time, as it is a key to helping orientees develop their critical thinking skills, prioritization, and practicing with skills not seen on the patient care unit. This off-unit time is valued by both the orientee and the preceptors. It gives dedicated time to discuss concepts and activities away from the bedside. Throughout orientation, the orientee is responsible for keeping a notebook where they jot down any notes or questions. This zero patient time is a great time to review the orientee's notebook. Other activities they will complete during this time include reviewing orientation resource guides, stacking cards, basic and critical thinking scenarios, medication scenarios, concept maps, hands-on time for practicing skills, and maybe some search it or find it cards to help them navigate through the electronic environment. That covers the basics of the tiered skills acquisition model. It's a different way to look at orientation by having one orientee and one preceptor cover a full assignment throughout orientation.
So that's the methods in a nutshell. Basically, the tiers were developed using Benner's novice to expert concepts. So I worked with preceptors to discover what are simpler skills, what are medium level skills, and what are more complex skills. Those skills have shifted as orientees and preceptors have used this process. So it is a fluid, dynamic process that we've needed to alter based on end user feedback. The other mention in there about the resource time or time to do debriefing, we've found that that is absolutely critical for new nurses to feel validated, to have their understandings and their reasoning double checked with the professional role of the preceptor. And so it's really important that that time working together away from the busyness of the clinical environment is supported. So what types of outcomes have we had so far? I should backtrack. I started this in 2 clinical units in the late summer of 2014 into the fall of 2014. Worked on it for about 6 months and realized there were some changes that absolutely needed to occur. Evolved it from that time, and then suddenly other people were starting to ask about it. They would float into a couple of the units that I support and wonder, something new is going on here. So other units wanted more information on this. So within about 6 months, I was working with other peers, other colleagues that wanted to work together to collaborate and figure this process out. So together, 2 other NES colleagues and I have collected data. That represents the 8 clinical units. Over 2 years, we've been analyzing. We've had 201 RNs go through this program. So we wanted to make sure that it was a solid process, that we weren't changing things unnecessarily. So we looked at qualitative survey data. We've always evaluated our preceptors and our orientees, but this became very, very important. We had to hear what they were saying about this process in order to understand changes that needed to happen. So a quote from one of the orientees that went through this: "I never felt alone in orientation. I am comfortable learning because my preceptor supports me and he gives me feedback." The preceptors have been instrumental in giving us feedback about this process. One preceptor stated, "The orientee recognizes changing situations. They are having many more patient experiences to gain knowledge." So those were pretty important themes, pretty important evaluation data that we continue to assess to make sure we were meeting the mark. The number of patient experiences, which the video alluded to and then I'll talk briefly about, it's very important for new nurses to have exposure in the clinical environment. In our previous incremental model, they were having 1 and then gradually 2 and then gradually 3 patients. So in 10 to 12 weeks, they were seeing maybe 70 to 80 patients during orientation. But in the new TSAM model, you'll notice they have a full assignment. Now on some units that could be 4 patients. On other units it could be 6 patients. It's all dependent on the clinical area that you're in. But adding this up for the full patient, full orientation, they're getting about 130 to 140 patient experiences. So that's increased almost 50% the number of patients that they're seeing. And you'll know when you see patients, even if you're not responsible for full care, you're still absorbing, watching, and observing the care that's going on in that room. That's been important. The overall length of orientation. So we looked at previously how long was our orientation in different areas. And it was typically about 12 weeks. In certain areas, progressive care areas, it might be a little bit longer. But we wanted to measure, are nurses taking longer in this method, or are they feeling more comfortable and confident sooner? And in all 8 of those clinical areas, our nurses were coming off orientation sooner, almost 2 weeks sooner. So you'll note that is pretty important when we're looking at the overall process for that clinical unit. And then RN retention is a big factor. Most organizations want to figure out how we keep our nurses. You'll know that the National Council of State Boards of Nurses report that up to 25% of nurses leave their nursing job within the first year. That's a national metric. So as an organization, we need to figure out how to get them and then how to keep them. To train a nurse in a clinical environment, the literature says it can cost anywhere from $50,000 to $80,000 for one nurse. So if we're losing nurses at 6 months or 9 months, it's really impacting the organization. So we have to figure out a way to make the orientation experience good. And then the cost avoidance. I really wanted to calculate how much did orientation cost before in the incremental method, and how much does orientation cost now? So I worked with our human resources to find out the magic number of what a preceptor pay is. I looked at it more from the preceptor perspective, because in the incremental model, they were only taking 1 or 2 patients with the orientee, and then we were having to hire multiple other nurses to come in and care for those patients on that unit because they weren't taking a full assignment. So now they're taking a full assignment, so we don't have to hire multiple other nurses to come into the unit to care for those other patients. So in 2 years, on 8 clinical units with 201 RNs, we've saved the organization $800,000. So this is an important factor when we report our outcomes. So some of the lessons learned, we learn lessons along the way. We've learned a lot of lessons in this program. We learn a lot of lessons while we're working. And when we're making any change, we learn a lot of lessons. So one of the highest, most important factors was collaboration and partnership. It really is key. Amy talked about partnership in her project. But partnering with the preceptors, partnering with the nurse managers, partnering with other NESs, and absolutely partnering with new nurses was very important to understanding this process. And understanding, listening to feedback is instrumental. Not just developing something, tying it up with a bow, handing it out, and then saying go for it and not to make any changes. That wouldn't work. So if you look at this process that was designed 3 years ago or 2.5 years ago, it looks far different today based on feedback from preceptors and orientees. Michael Patton, as we've talked about in developmental evaluation, one of the textbooks that we read in this program, talks about that grassroots approach, the bottom up, not always the top down, makes successful changes. And this truly was a grassroots approach. Started on 2 clinical units 2.5 years ago. I was pretty quiet about it, wanted it just to be a quality improvement project, didn't want too many people to know about it, but then suddenly people wanted to know more. And actually within 18 months, 39 clinical units were using this method. Another lesson that was key is certainly that the project process is as important as the accomplishment. So those learnings along the way, the changes, the revisions, the new partnerships that are developed are key to any project at all. So how does this advance nursing practice? Improving orientation experiences we know impacts role satisfaction, not only for the orientee, but for the preceptor. We know it impacts employee engagement, and we know the intention to continue to practice nursing is impacted by orientation. We know that using literature helps us provide a framework for improving processes, and we'll continue to look at different methods for orientation to continue to improve it. Empowering preceptors to be successful in their role, really you have to have continuous development of preceptors in order to have a solid program. And then obviously disseminating any practice changes, good or bad, so that others can learn from it is very, very important. So through disseminating these findings, actually with nursing administration just last fall, there is support now for this model to be all roles within the Department of Nursing. So not only our RNs, but it will be the method for our LPNs, for our PCAs, for our interns, for our health unit coordinators. So it's an important framework that we know we can replicate using some of the elements and concepts. So in conclusion, improving the quality and efficiency of orientation really did require leadership, commitment, creativity, and flexibility, but also cultivating an environment that's open to changes and encourages all perspectives to be heard is very, very important. And that's something this program really highlights, is listening to all perspectives and having an open and receptive attitude to different perspectives. One of the greatest moments during the practice journey was really creating and sustaining those partnerships that we talked about. This process wouldn't have changed without partnership and collaboration. And being a transformational nurse leader requires knowledge and experience, certainly, but more importantly, it requires serving others, demonstrating humility, and empowering others to make a lasting impact. I hope that I've demonstrated this type of leadership the last 3 years during this DNP project. I've been busy presenting some information on this. I've been actually working very closely with our preceptor program at Mayo, just trying to let preceptors understand some of the role responsibilities and then working with preceptors to help design what would work best in their area. So that will continue, and then some other events. I'm excited to present this nationally this summer in New Orleans at an association for nurses in professional development. A few of the references I didn't. And then my transformational tree. So that shows the seasons of that tree transformation, just like that nurse does transform in that first year practice. So I'd like to open it up for questions.
Well, first of all, something I'm curious about. So with my BSN students, there is a lot of talk, especially among those who are preceptors at Mayo, who are going through this process. So it's really wonderful to hear the discussions that are going on about what this looks like in practice. So there's a huge wave of discussion and interest in what you're doing.
Great.
So it's absolutely wonderful. I'm curious, in your opinion, what makes a good preceptor? What type of qualities do you see in a preceptor that's effective in this process?
Yeah, so when I first started this project, I really thought my key stakeholder was the orientee. I was building things for the orientee, but ultimately it was only a couple of weeks that I figured out my key stakeholder was the preceptor. This dramatically changes the role of a preceptor. They cannot precept the way they used to be precepting in this method. And so what characteristics do we look for in a good preceptor? We want a preceptor to have passion for nursing. We hope that all of our preceptors do. We want them to be patient. We want them to also provide feedback. We want them to be good evaluators of practice. So they need to know their clinical resources. They should be following guidelines and policies. They should know where those policies are located. They should also be able to step in when things need to be stepped into, but also they need to identify when to hold back and not be hovering or overbearing. So there are multiple characteristics that you look for, and most of all, they have to want to be a good teacher of nursing concepts and really what the role responsibility is of the nurse. So there's a lot of characteristics. Now I would wish every preceptor had all those, but we develop preceptors too. We continuously develop preceptors, so those are things we would look for.
Beautiful. It sounds like an art and a science.
It is,
balance.
absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Well, I have a question that piggybacks on this because I too was thinking about the change. Well, first of all, wonderful, absolutely wonderful project, and it's so exciting to see how your small seeds that you planted on your unit have grown into 39 units. I mean, that's phenomenal. So pat yourself on the back for that.
But it's not me alone.
I know it takes a village.
Yeah.
But as I was thinking about the role of the preceptor, that was the first thing that jumped into my head. Is this was a huge transition. I'm thinking sometimes when you would have students as a nurse, how you'd say, oh, just let the student go in and take care of that patient, and I'm just going to hang out here at the desk. But I was real curious how you talked about how they do everything
together. That's the ideal. I'm hopeful that is what's happening, although we know we can always improve things. But we can't bundle out. Just because a new nurse has accomplished, say, Tier 3, which Tier 1 is just shadowing the nurse, Tier 2 is vital signs assessments, 3 is medications. Just because they've been kind of signed off of those tiers, we don't want them to just go into a patient's room and simply do those things and not talk to a family member because they can't talk about discharge planning or they can't talk about equipment. We want it to be a well-oiled experience, and so that you need the preceptor to help with some of those higher level questions that might occur in the room. The orientee might be capable of doing the tiers that they've been signed off of, but it really is a collaborative. They really are together. So it's important for preceptors to understand that concept too, because they want to give them some freedom, but it's very, very important that they're the eyes, the ears, they're kind of watching what's happening in the room. And important for them to give the orientee feedback. If they're at the desk, 6 rooms away, really hard to give an orientee feedback on their performance if you haven't heard it. Right. Yeah.
Did you have difficulty getting buy-in from the preceptors?
Some of my preceptors initially were confused about what their role responsibility was. And so there hasn't been difficulty with buy-in because they see that it makes a difference. Preceptors have actually said this type of precepting is easier because they have specific learning objectives that they're evaluating in each tier. Whereas before, the preceptor was kind of evaluating everything all at once and didn't have specific objectives. So preceptors have actually said that it's more structured. There's more knowledge of what they should be looking for the orientee to do. So there is a gradual shift. I now call it the culture of precepting, and I'm working on the culture of developing and fostering good preceptor practices, so that is continuing.
So patient response when 2 nurses walk into the unit or
So,
into their room.
Yeah. So you have to tee that up right, because they don't want, they want to make sure it's not always the rookie or, whoever is in the room. They want to make sure that they're going to be well cared for in a safe manner. And so typically our preceptors will say, I am working today with Joyce. Joyce is in orientation. Joyce is doing a fabulous job, but I'm the eyes and ears of things that happen in the room. So you'll see both of us here, and that's the reason why. Near the end of orientation, oftentimes the preceptors will tell patients and families, I might not be right next to Joyce, but I'm outside the hall or behind the curtain. I call it curtain creeping, I know. Listening to what they're saying. So you might see my legs back here. Don't be alarmed, but that's what I'm doing. And they do so that they can give the orientee that feedback. Yeah, so.
Yeah. Ellen, I had a question. I know it's the acquisition model, but it strikes me that you're really building competence, which is a much more holistic view of practice in that way, orientation. So I commend you on that integration and approach.
Sure.
But I had a question on a couple of details. And so within that model of the tiers, I noticed, I think I heard in the video that it said mastery. So my first question is, how do you judge, kind of assess that mastery to move from Tier 1 to Tier 2?
Yeah.
And then my other question is, you mentioned 39 units using it, and with the developmental approach, do the units have some variability in crafting it for their unit, and then, or do you bring it back to the model or the approach and kind of integrate that into the templates?
Yeah, so interesting, because there's a lot of work going on right now. But back to your first question about how do you know when they master a skill or master a tier? There are specific objectives that are listed out. There's a document. It's the TSAM record is what we call it. And the orientee is responsible for carrying that or holding it. But the preceptor looks at it. They know which tier they're on and they know which learning objectives they're going to accomplish that day. The preceptor will not sign them off on a learning objective until the orientee is doing that objective independently. So in Tier 3, medication administration, there's several learning objectives. Passes medications in a safe manner using the 5 patient safety rights, is able to articulate the documenting and the side effects of medications administered, does things in a timely manner so medications are not withheld. I mean, there's multiple learning objectives. So that preceptor we coach in saying they're ready to be signed off if you're not there telling them everything. Like, okay, it's time for the next set of medications. They have to be independent in thinking and doing that. And so then the preceptor will sign off on it. And so how does this look, say, in our psychiatric department? I've focused kind of on a surgical inpatient area. How does this look in OB? What does this look like in the pediatrics? So the framework for the tiers, simple to medium to complex, is really one of the main concepts. The other concept is having specific learning objectives. So the objectives in my area might and do look different than the objectives in the psychiatry area. Psych has their safety environment, their environment of checking the room for any threatening weapons. That is all floated up to one of the very first things that they do. Now you'll note that's not in any of my tiers because it's not practical to my clinical environment. So it's moldable and adaptable depending on which clinical area you're in. But there are 4 concepts that have to remain. That is the tier, so whatever the tier spelled out, the learning objectives, and then some dates and signatures from the preceptor so we can track when the orientee mastered those skills. So does that help? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
First of all, it's so beautiful. Thank you for this important work.
Sure.
I really like your model, your camera with a tree. It's very powerful, and it's so wonderful that you've been holding on to this tree for years.
Well.
More meaningful. So
Yeah.
It's a very beautiful model. I wonder how you plan to share any of this with Dr. Benner.
You know, that would be a thrill, actually, to be able to share the impact that she's created a lot of great work. And so I have her website. You know, she has I'm on her listserv, and I haven't spoken with her, but I could certainly email her. I'm sure she would be interested.
She would be proud and inspired.
Yeah.
This is very amazing work at a very important institution in Minnesota.
Yeah.
I think she would be very proud that you have applied it in this way.
In this way,
So,
yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yep.
Well, Ellen, congratulations. I appreciated your presentation a lot. I've had the opportunity to read your paper in pieces, and
Yes.
this really pulls it together. A question or a thought I had, it occurred to me that your outcomes are really positive and looking good. I'm wondering how willing the powers that be are to wait for some outcomes as well, because some of these outcomes, these wonderful outcomes, might be down the road a bit.
Yeah.
And what do you think about that?
Yeah. So there was some interest within 6 months of this framework because there was people were getting wind that it was cheaper. And I don't know how, because we weren't having to hire extra nurses on the units that I supported. We were able to do it And so there was some pressure initially, and I really didn't speak or look at outcomes for a full year into this. And then I looked at outcomes, I shared them with my supervisor, and she said, you know, Ellen, this is well and good, but it's only 2 units, and we have like 140 units here. So I don't know that that could translate into positive outcomes elsewhere. So she had suggested I work with other colleagues to gather at least 8 units of data or 10 units of data. Now, as we move forward, we're hoping that clinical units, NESs, and managers will continue to look at their unit-specific data, and I'm working with NESs to show them how I collected my data and that it is very manageable. But that's true. We have to be careful. And honestly, I'm starting to emerge on my 3rd year data, and I'm finding some things that are a little surprising to me. The retention bit is a little bit surprising. I won't have that solid figure until December of this year, but I think we're seeing a slight dip in retention, and I'm curious why that is. So I'll have to investigate that a little bit further. But the 8 units, we'll know that in December of 17 this year when we collect it all again. So yeah,
And
appreciate.
I'm thinking like 3 years, 5
Years, yeah.
10 years.
Yes, yeah, longitudinal, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you.